Bullets were tearing through the extraction zone, and the only aircraft capable of surviving the rescue was a classified experimental gunship nobody on base knew how to fly. When the desperate SEAL commander screamed for a pilot, a quiet 28-year-old woman stepped forward. What happened next defies every military playbook ever written. The Tactical Operations Center at Forward Operating Base Kodiak was a claustrophobic tomb of glowing monitors and suffocating tension. Outside, a freak Category 3 blizzard was tearing across the jagged peaks of the Alai Mountains, hammering the reinforced steel of the bunker with deafening rhythmic thuds. But inside the TOC, the only sound that mattered was the frantic, static-laced radio transmission bleeding through the overhead speakers. Kodiak, this is Viper Actual. We are pinned down in Sector Grid 49er. We have the package, but we're taking heavy RPG and sustained PKM fire. We have 2 urgent surgical casualties. I repeat, 2 operators down. We need exfil now, or we're coming home in bags. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Hayes slammed his fist onto the tactical map table, the thud echoing sharply in the silent room. A veteran Navy SEAL with scars mapping his 2 decades of Black Ops deployments, Hayes wasn't a man who panicked, but right now, staring at the flashing red icons surrounding his men on the digital map, his blood ran cold. "Where the hell is our air support?" Hayes barked, his voice ragged. He turned to the base commander, General Richard Croft. "General, my men have the high-value target. They did their job. Now we need to do ours and get them out." Croft, a stern man with deep-set eyes, shook his head slowly. "Commander, you hear that wind? We're looking at 70-knot gusts, 0 visibility. The hostile anti-air network is fully active in that valley. If I send a Black Hawk or a Chinook out there, they'll be swatted out of the sky before they even cross the ridgeline. Fast movers can't hover to extract. We have nothing that can survive that soup." "What about Hangar 4? Hayes demanded, his eyes narrowing. "What about the Manticore?" A heavy silence fell over the command center. Hangar 4 housed the X-44 Manticore, a heavily classified billion-dollar prototype. It was a monstrous hybrid tilt-rotor gunship, roughly the size of a C-130, coated in radar-absorbent materials and armed with enough firepower to level a city block. It was designed specifically for this kind of nightmare scenario. Stealthy enough to evade radar, tough enough to take a hit, and fast enough to outrun a storm. The troops colloquially called it the Beast. "The Beast is grounded," Croft said flatly. "Major Henderson, the chief test pilot, collapsed 3 hours ago from a ruptured appendix. He's in the infirmary, under the knife. The secondary pilot is in Germany. That aircraft requires a neural-linked fly-by-wire profile. You can't just put a regular transport pilot in the seat. It's notoriously unstable. If they don't know the software, it'll tear itself apart in mid-air." Hayes gripped the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. His earpiece crackled again with the sound of automatic gunfire and a muffled scream from one of his men. "General, I have 6 men bleeding out on a mountain. I don't care if it's unstable. We need someone who can fly this beast. I will fly it myself if I have to." "You wouldn't make it off the tarmac, Commander." A calm, steady voice cut through the heavy air of the TOC. Hayes turned, his eyes landing on a figure standing near the logistics desk. It was Captain Chloe Mitchell. At 5'4", with her dark hair pulled back into a strict regulation bun, she looked entirely out of place among the hulking special operators and weathered generals. Officially, Mitchell was a logistics flight coordinator, a glorified dispatcher who occasionally flew supply runs in aging cargo planes. She had been assigned to Kodiak a month ago, mostly keeping to herself, analyzing flight telemetry in the corner. Hayes scowled, his patience non-existent. "Captain, unless you can magically spawn a test pilot, keep quiet. This is a tactical crisis." Mitchell didn't flinch. She stepped forward, moving away from the shadows of the monitors, her gaze locked directly on Hayes. "I'm not spawning a test pilot, Commander. I am one. I can fly the Manticore." Hayes stared at her, a bitter, humorless laugh escaping his lips. "You, Captain, I've seen your file. You fly supply runs to safe zones. This is a billion-dollar experimental war machine flying into a Category 3 blizzard to extract operators under heavy fire. Sit down before you embarrass yourself." Mitchell closed the distance between them, her posture radiating an icy, unshakable authority that made even General Croft raise an eyebrow. "You've seen my unclassified file, Commander," Mitchell said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "What you haven't seen is that for the last 3 years, I was the shadow pilot for DARPA's Rotary Wing Division at Edwards Air Force Base. When Major Henderson couldn't handle the multi-axis G-force transitions during the Manticore's simulated dive tests, DARPA put me in the seat to rewrite the avionics parameters. I didn't just fly the beast, Commander. I taught it how to fly." Hayes looked at General Croft, silently demanding verification. Croft frantically typed his security credentials into a classified terminal. A few seconds later, a highly redacted file appeared on his screen. Croft's eyes widened. "She's telling the truth, Hayes," Croft murmured, genuine shock coloring his tone. "Captain Mitchell holds a Level 7 experimental rating. She logged over 400 hours in the X-44 simulator and 60 hours of live-fire night flights before the program was moved here." "Then why the hell is she pushing papers at a logistics desk?" Hayes demanded. Mitchell's jaw tightened. "Because during a live-fire test, a higher-up ordered me to push the engines past structural redline for a PR demonstration. I refused, citing catastrophic failure risks. I saved the aircraft, but humiliated a 3-star general I was quietly reassigned to keep me out of the spotlight. But none of that matters right now. Your men have maybe 20 minutes before they are overrun. The Manticore is fueled. I know its quirks, and I am the only chance your men have." Hayes stared into her eyes. He was looking for hesitation, for ego, for the slightest tremor of doubt. He found none, only a terrifying cold competence. Hayes keyed his radio. "Viper Actual, this is Kodiak. Hold your ground. We are coming to get you." He turned to Mitchell, his expression hardening into stone. "Suit up, Captain. If you kill my team, I'll shoot you myself." "Get in line, Commander," Mitchell replied, already turning toward the blast doors. Wheels up in 5. The interior of Hangar 4 felt like a cathedral built for the god of war. Dominating the massive space was the X-44 Manticore. It was a breathtaking, terrifying piece of engineering. Coated in matte black radar-absorbent paint, its sweeping angular fuselage looked like a stealth bomber that had been crossbred with an attack helicopter. The massive propellers on the ends of its wings were currently tilted upward, waiting to devour the sky. Chief Engineer Brody Evans was frantically running diagnostics on a ruggedized tablet when Mitchell and Hayes approached, trailed by 4 heavily armed SEALs, acting as the extraction team. "Brody, pull the chocks and prime the auxiliary power units," Mitchell shouted over the ambient roar of the hangar's heating fans as she tossed a heavy flight helmet from a gear rack to her chest. Evans looked up, his face pale. "Mitchell, what the hell are you doing? You can't fly this." The avionics matrix was updating when Henderson collapsed. "The fly-by-wire system is bugged. The stealth profile is reading a localized short. It's a flying brick right now." "Bypass the automated safety limiters," Mitchell ordered, climbing the ramp into the belly of the beast. "Switch the flight control system to manual override." Evans chased her up the ramp. "Are you insane? Manual override on a tilt rotor in a hurricane. The asymmetric lift will flip you into the hangar roof before you clear the doors." "I'll balance the cyclic trim manually," Mitchell shot back, sliding into the pilot's seat in the glass cockpit. She began flipping switches with blinding, practiced speed. The dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree, bathing her face in the harsh green glow of the multifunction displays, MFDs. "Load the terrain following radar and mute the caution alarms. They're just going to distract me." Hayes strapped himself into the jump seat directly behind the cockpit, his assault rifle resting on his knees. He watched her hands blur across the control panels. He had ridden in hundreds of aircraft, but the sheer complexity of the Manticore's cockpit made his head spin. "Lieutenant David Barnes is coming with you," Evans yelled over the whining pitch of the APU spooling up. A young, terrified-looking co-pilot scrambled into the seat next to Mitchell. "He knows the weapon systems, but Mitchell, listen to me. I checked the logs. The stealth profile didn't just short out. Someone wiped the encrypted handshake protocols for the radar jammer. The system was sabotaged." Mitchell froze, her hand hovering over the engine ignition sequence. She locked eyes with Evans. "Sabotaged? I don't have time to trace it," Evans stammered. "But if you fly into that valley, the enemy SAM batteries will see you the second you cross the border. The stealth is compromised. Hayes leaned forward, his voice lethal. General Croft has a mole on base, or a contractor who didn't want this prototype risked in a live fire zone. Mitchell, Hayes said slowly, can we survive without the stealth? Only if I fly nap of the earth, Mitchell said. I'm talking 50 feet off the deck, navigating through a canyon network in a blizzard at 300 knots. If I clip a single pine tree, we become a fireball. Can you do it? Hayes asked. Mitchell gripped the throttles. Strap in tight, boys. It's going to be a bumpy ride. She engaged the main engines. The Manticore shook violently as the twin Rolls-Royce turboshaft engines screamed to life, generating over 12,000 shaft horsepower. The sheer concussive force of the rotors threatened to shatter the hangar windows. Hangar doors opening. The base traffic controller crackled over the radio. The massive steel doors parted, revealing a wall of howling white snow. The storm was vicious, whipping frozen shrapnel sideways. Kodiak Tower, Manticore 1 is heavy and hot. Requesting immediate departure, Mitchell called out, her voice entirely devoid of panic. Manticore 1, you are cleared. Godspeed. Mitchell pulled up on the collective. The beast groaned, the massive airframe lifting off the concrete. But the moment the skids left the floor, a violent alarm shrieked through the cockpit. Warning, pitch anomaly, asymmetric thrust, warning. The sabotaged fly-by-wire system violently seized control, throwing the nose of the massive gunship downward. The Manticore bucked like a wild stallion, banking sharply to the left, the massive right rotor blade dipping perilously close to the hangar's steel support beams. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Barnes panicked, grabbing his controls, trying to pull up. Let go of the stick, Mitchell roared. She realized instantly what the system was doing. It was feeding false telemetry to the rotors, convinced the aircraft was inverted. If she fought it with standard corrections, the computer would overcompensate and snap the wings off. Hayes braced for impact, his teeth rattling in his skull. She's going to kill us right here, he thought. Mitchell didn't pull back. Defying every natural instinct, she pushed the stick forward, leaning into the dive, and simultaneously slammed her hand onto the manual severance switch, physically cutting the data link between the flight computer and the rotor servos. The computer screamed in protest, throwing sparks from a short-circuited panel near Barnes's knee. With the automated system dead, the true raw weight of the 70,000-pound aircraft fell entirely onto Mitchell's mechanical controls. Her muscles strained as she pulled the heavy yoke back with all her strength, her boots slamming against the anti-torque pedals. The Manticore groaned, the metal screaming under the sheer kinetic stress. Less than 5 feet from crashing into the concrete floor, the nose pitched up. The aircraft stabilized, hovering perfectly in the center of the hangar doors. Hayes let out a breath he didn't know he was holding. The SEALs in the back were dead silent. Mitchell didn't celebrate. She didn't even blink. She pushed the throttle forward, and the beast shot out of the hangar into the blinding blizzard, immediately swallowed by the night. The turbulence was apocalyptic. The wind battered the fuselage, tossing the massive aircraft around like a toy. Mitchell fought the yoke, her eyes glued to the FLIR, forward-looking infrared, and the digital terrain map. Outside the cockpit glass, there was nothing but a swirling, chaotic wall of white. Crossing the border in 3 minutes, Barnes called out, his hands visibly shaking as he monitored the navigation panel. We're entering the radar net. Dropping altitude, Mitchell replied, navigating into the Kestrel Gorge. I need weapons hot, Barnes. If anything pops up in front of us, I want it dead before we hit it. Weapons armed, Barnes confirmed, activating the 105mm howitzer and the 30mm chain guns mounted in the belly. The Manticore dove into the canyon, a narrow, jagged scar carved into the mountains. Mitchell leveled the aircraft, a terrifying 60 feet above the frozen river at the canyon's base. The rock walls on either side were mere yards from the rotor tips. She was flying purely on instrument telemetry and raw intuition, weaving the massive airframe through the winding gorge at nearly 280 miles per hour. Hayes watched her from behind. He was mesmerized. The sheer physical exertion required to keep the heavy bird level was immense. Yet Mitchell's movements were fluid, precise, almost artistic. She anticipated the brutal crosswinds pouring over the canyon lips, rolling the aircraft preemptively to catch the downdrafts. She was doing the impossible. Suddenly, the cockpit was bathed in a flashing red light. A high-pitched, steady tone squealed through their headsets. Barnes's face drained of blood. "Missile lock. We're painted. A hostile SA-15 battery on the ridge just acquired us. The radar scattering isn't working." "I know," Mitchell said, her eyes locked on the digital horizon. "Hold on." "Missile in the air," Barnes screamed. "Impact in 12 seconds. "Deploying flares," Hayes shouted over the din. "No," Mitchell said, her voice eerily calm as she shoved the throttles to the firewall. "Flares won't decoy a radar-guided warhead. We're going to have to outfly it." 10 seconds to impact," Barnes screamed, his voice cracking an octave as he braced his hands against the glowing dashboard. The radar warning receiver was no longer beeping. It was emitting a solid, soul-piercing wail that signified an unavoidable terminal lock. A Russian-made SA-15 Gauntlet missile, carrying a 30 pounds high-explosive fragmentation warhead, was screaming down the canyon toward them at Mach 2.5. "Mitchell, do something!" Hayes yelled from the jump seat, fighting the G-forces pressing him into his restraints. Mitchell's eyes darted across the digital topographical map. The stealth systems were dead. The fly-by-wire computer was violently severed, and they had no radar chaff to blind the incoming seeker head in a massive 70,000 pounds tilt rotor. Outrunning a supersonic missile was mathematically impossible, but Mitchell wasn't trying to outrun it. "Hold your breath," she commanded coldly. Instead of pulling up to evade, Mitchell shoved the yoke forward and rolled the Manticore into a brutal 60 degrees bank. The massive aircraft plummeted toward the frozen river at the bottom of the gorge. The altimeter spun downward in a terrifying blur. 100 feet, 80 feet, 40 feet. "Pull up, pull up." The automated ground proximity alarm shrieked. Through the snow-blind windshield, a massive jagged limestone pillar loomed directly in their flight path, splitting the river in two. Mitchell waited until the absolute last millisecond, letting the missile's tracking radar commit to its trajectory. "Now," Mitchell yelled. She stomped on the left anti-torque pedal and hauled back on the yoke with agonizing force. The Manticore's massive rotors bit into the freezing air, ripping the aircraft into a violent, skidding lateral turn that sent the starboard wingtip mere inches from the canyon wall. The maneuver threw a rooster tail of ice and river water hundreds of feet into the air. The SA-15 missile, traveling too fast to adjust to the sudden, impossible deviation, lost its radar lock in the massive cloud of kicked-up ice and slammed directly into the limestone pillar. The explosion was deafening. A massive shock wave hammered the rear of the Manticore, sending a shower of red sparks raining down from the overhead circuit breakers. The aircraft bucked wildly, but Mitchell's grip on the manual controls was like iron. She wrestled the beast back into level flight, breathing heavily, sweat soaking the collar of her flight suit despite the freezing temperature in the cockpit. Barnes opened his eyes, pale and hyperventilating. He looked at the radar screen. The lock was gone. "Jesus, Mary and Joseph," Hayes whispered from the back, staring at the back of Mitchell's helmet in absolute awe. He had flown with the best pilots in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment. None of them could have pulled that off without a functioning flight computer. "Status on the engines," Mitchell barked, breaking the silence. "Port engine intake temperature is running hot. We ingested some ice, but thrust is stable at 92%, Barnes stammered, pulling himself together. "We are 2 miles from the extraction grid." "Transitioning to hover mode," Mitchell announced. She toggled the NL controls. Outside, the massive wingtip engines began to pivot upward, shifting from airplane mode to helicopter configuration. The Manticore rapidly decelerated, the aerodynamic braking throwing Hayes against his harness. Ahead of them, the blizzard broke just enough to reveal a terrifying scene. A steep, snow-covered mountain ridge was illuminated by the strobing flashes of intense gunfire. Down in a shallow crater, Hayes's SEAL team was trapped. Green tracer rounds from American M4 carbines fired desperately up the slope, heavily outnumbered by the red tracers of enemy PKM machine guns and rocket-propelled grenades pouring down from the tree line. The enemy infantry was advancing, closing the net around the wounded operators. "Viper Actual, this is Manticore 1, Mitchell transmitted, her voice cutting through the chaotic radio frequency. "Keep your heads down. We are bringing the rain." She turned to her co-pilot. "Barnes, I'm giving you a stable firing platform. I want that tree line erased." "Weapons free," Barnes yelled, his training finally overriding his terror. He gripped the gunner's control stick, the targeting reticle projecting onto his helmet visor. Mitchell swung the massive nose of the beast toward the enemy positions, hovering the aircraft in the teeth of the 70-knot crosswinds. To the hostile forces on the ground, the Manticore must have looked like a demon rising from the snowstorm. Dens squeezed the trigger. The belly-mounted 30mm chain guns roared to life, vibrating the entire airframe. A devastating stream of high-explosive incendiary rounds chewed through the tree line, vaporizing pine trees, boulders, and enemy combatants in a catastrophic wave of fire. The enemy focused their fire on the Manticore. Hundreds of small arms rounds pinged against the radar-absorbent armor plating, but the Kevlar-reinforced belly held strong. "Give them the howitzer," Mitchell ordered, watching an enemy technical, a heavily armored truck mounting a DSK anti-aircraft gun, rolling over the ridge. Bdens toggled to the 105mm cannon. Thoom! The massive artillery shell ejected from the side of the Manticore with a concussive blast that temporarily pushed the aircraft sideways. The shell impacted directly beneath the enemy truck, flipping the 10-ton vehicle into the air in a blinding fireball. The hostile fire ceased almost instantly. The remaining enemy fighters broke and fled into the blizzard, terrified of the unkillable monster hovering above them. "Target area is suppressed," Bdens reported, breathing hard. "Viper actual, prep for immediate extraction," Hayes barked into the radio. "Kodiak, we have a problem." The SEAL team leader's voice crackled back, thick with exhaustion. "We have 2 men on backboards, and the high-value target is a civilian. He's injured. We can't hike down to a flat LZ. You have to come to us." Mitchell looked out the side window. The SEALs were dug into a 45 degrees incline of loose shale and deep snow. "Commander," Barnes said, shaking his head, "a tilt rotor can't land on a slope that steep. The rotors will strike the mountain. We need a flat clearing." Mitchell didn't hesitate. "We don't need a flat clearing. I'll make one." Mitchell nudged the cyclic forward, inching the massive 70,000-pound aircraft toward the sheer face of the mountain. "Mitchell, what are you doing?" Hayes demanded over the roar of the engines. "A pinnacle landing," she replied, her eyes locked on the terrain. "I'm going to rest the front landing gear on that rock outcropping and hover the rear. I can hold it steady for exactly 60 seconds before the asymmetric thermal load burns out the rear stabilizers. Tell your boys to run." Hayes keyed his mic. "Viper actual, the ramp is dropping. You have 1 minute." Mitchell brought the Manticore in with agonizing precision. The massive rotor blades churned a hurricane of snow, spinning just feet away from the rocky cliff face. With a heavy metal crunch, the front tires touched down on the narrow ledge. Mitchell instantly worked the pedals, and the collective, balancing the titanic weight of the aircraft entirely on its nose wheels, while the back half of the ship dangled precariously over the dark, snowy abyss. Because the automated computer was dead, Mitchell had to manually counter every single gust of wind. Her hands were a blur of micro-adjustments, her forearms trembling under the immense physical strain. The rear cargo ramp lowered. Hayes sprinted to the back as the SEALs emerged from the snow, dragging 2 medical sleds and supporting the high-value target, Dr. Arthur Caldwell, an abducted American defense contractor. "Go, go, go," Hayes bellowed, hauling the stretchers aboard. Suddenly, the Manticore's communication console crackled with an unencrypted localized transmission from Caldwell's stolen radio. "Alpha Team, the target is being extracted. Move your SAM batteries to the valley exit. Do not let Dr. Caldwell leave this airspace alive. Authorization code actual." Hayes froze, staring at the radio. Caldwell collapsed onto the cargo deck, clutching his ribs. "Commander, the ambush," he gasped. "They knew exactly where to find us. General Croft. He sold my orbital weapons schematics to the black market. He sent your team out here to be slaughtered so there would be no witnesses." Hayes felt a cold, murderous fury ignite in his chest. Everything made terrifying sense. The grounded pilots, the wiped stealth profile. Croft had purposefully sabotaged the rescue mission to protect his treason. "We're loaded. Ramp up," Hayes roared. He stormed back toward the cockpit, his eyes dark with vengeance. "Mitchell, get us out of here. We have a traitor to hunt." Mitchell pulled the collective, ripping the Manticore off the cliff face just as a fresh wave of RPG fire erupted from the distant tree line. "We have a problem." Croft repositioned the SAM batteries to the canyon exit. "If we fly out the way we came, we're dead. Can we go over the mountain?" Barnes asked. "Service ceiling is 12,000 feet, Mitchell said, looking at the towering 14,000 feet peaks surrounding them. "Unless we push the engines past the structural red line." "Do it," Hayes ordered. "Break the damn thing if you have to." Mitchell slammed the throttles to the firewall and pulled the yoke back. The twin turboshaft engines screamed in absolute agony, the RPM gauges pinning into the deep red zone. The Manticore pitched upward at a terrifying angle, climbing the sheer face of the mountain like a rocket. The metal airframe groaned violently. Rivets began to pop in the cargo bay. Heat alarms blared continuously, warning of an imminent turbine meltdown, but Mitchell held the throttles pinned. 12,000 feet, 13,000 feet, 13,500 feet. The aircraft was violently shaking, struggling to stay airborne in the thin air. Just as the engine temperature gauges flashed a catastrophic failure warning, the Manticore cleared the jagged peak of the mountain by less than 20 feet. "Over the top," Mitchell shouted, instantly cutting the throttles and throwing the aircraft into a steep gliding dive down the other side, completely bypassing the waiting SAM ambush. 45 minutes later, at Forward Operating Base Kodiak, General Croft stood in the Tactical Operations Center. "Log the Manticore as lost with all hands due to extreme weather," Croft ordered his communications officer. "General," a radar operator shouted, "I have a massive contact dropping out of the clouds." Before Croft could react, the earth-shaking roar of the Manticore's rotors drowned out the storm. The massive black gunship descended from the blizzard, its hull scarred with bullet holes, smoke billowing from the port engine, but completely intact. It slammed onto the tarmac with a heavy thud. Croft backed away from the tactical table in horror. The heavy blast doors to the TOC violently kicked open. Commander Hayes marched in, covered in snow and blood, his assault rifle aimed directly at Croft's chest. 4 furious SEALs fanned out behind him. "Commander Hayes," Croft stammered, "what is the meaning of this?" "The meaning, General," Hayes whispered lethally, "is treason." Hayes slammed the stock of his rifle into Croft's jaw, sending the corrupt general to the floor. "Secure him for a military tribunal." Outside on the frozen tarmac, in the cockpit of the smoking, ruined Manticore, Captain Chloe Mitchell slowly unbuckled her harness. Her hands were blistered, her muscles aching down to the bone. Hayes walked out of the bunker and up to the nose of the aircraft. Mitchell slid the side window open and looked down at the hardened SEAL commander. Hayes offered a slow, deeply respectful salute. "Captain Mitchell," he said softly, "you're not flying a desk ever again." Mitchell wiped a streak of grease from her cheek, staring at the smoking beast she had just tamed. "Good," she replied, "because this thing needs a lot of work." Captain Chloe Mitchell's name may have been buried in classified files, but her legend echoes through the halls of military aviation forever. When the impossible was demanded, she didn't just step up. She rewrote the rules of the sky and brought heroes home. True courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking the controls when everyone else says you'll fail. If this incredible story of bravery and skill kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more untold stories of real-life heroes.